Welcome to my day of celebrating my new book, Nutrivore. Let's go through some of these questions. I'm just going to scroll back to the beginning. So Courtney asked, how would you say your book is different from other nutrition books? And I love this question. So let me first answer kind of how Nutrivore is different from other nutrition approaches, and then I can kind of explain how the book is different. I watch your walks on Instagram and have heard you on podcasts, but I don't remember what the Nutrivore way is. Perfect. Let me answer that question. So Nutrivore is not a diet. It is a dietary philosophy with the singular goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat. So when you think of food, that basically as like, I want to hit my body's requirements of essential vitamins, essential minerals. I want to get the amount of fiber that my gastrointestinal tract needs and the amount of protein that I need. There's other nutrients that are non-essential but are really important for health. I want to get those too. When we just think about choosing foods so that all of the nutrients those foods contain add up throughout the day to meet our needs of all those nutrients while staying within our caloric requirement range, you really quickly see that there's millions of different ways to choose foods to achieve that goal. And the really important thing about that is it kind of completely liberates you from diet rules and yes food lists and no food lists and thinking about food in those sort of black and white terms. And then when you start to bring in diet psychology into that approach, you see that there's studies dating back to the 90s that show that thinking about foods in black and white terms, which is how most diets do it, right? That's where I come from too. That's how I used to think. That those they're called dichotomous approaches to diet, right? Black and white thinking, yes, food lists and no food lists. That increases the risk of food fixation, obsession, cravings, emotional eating, disordered eating patterns, and yo-yo dieting. So whether you're yo-yo dieting as weight regain cycles or you're just on again, off again in terms of like healthy diet and I don't have the energy or the capacity to choose healthy foods right now. I'm just going to eat whatever I want, right? And that kind of swing back and forth. And so the reason why that's important is because how I eat today doesn't really matter for my health. It's how I eat on average over the long term, right? That's what's going to actually affect my risk of cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes or cancer down the line. And not that eating is the only thing that affects those things. Lifestyle is important. Social determinants of health is important. Genetics is important. Other health-related behaviors, like whether or not I smoke or drink, is going to be important, right? So, but eating is 40-ish%. So it's still like it's a big chunk of that risk. So incorporating that understanding, the idea being sustainable nutrition, right? Like higher quality diet that is enjoyable, that feels good, that's easy, that doesn't take too much time or energy, that doesn't take more money than I have, that is foods that I really like to eat so I don't feel deprived. That is what Nutrivore is, right? That is the goal of Nutrivore. So Nutrivore is as much this like really simple goal as it is the nutritional sciences education so that we can choose foods within those we like and have access to and can afford and align with other dietary priorities. Maybe there's certain foods that I want to avoid for religious purposes, right? Like, or my doctor has told me to eat certain foods, right? So we can stack on those other dietary priorities within that Nutrivore framework. So it's really about just understanding what nutrients do in the body, what foods contain what nutrients, and how to choose different foods to get that full range of nutrients, and then how to adapt that to my own individual needs and wants. And so that is Nutrivore. So that's how the book is different, right? The book is laying out the philosophy and examining that interesting diet psychology, where diet culture really does us a disservice and kind of explains why moral judgments of foods doesn't help us to eat a higher quality diet over the long term. It does that like base knowledge of nutrients and what foods contain them. And then one of the things that I do in the second part of the book, the goal is to make caring about nutrients really personal. So what I do, instead of explaining what like every single nutrient does in depth, because that would be a nutritional sciences textbook, is I do 27 different examinations of the link between one specific nutrient and one specific common health complaint, symptom, or goal. So I cover diverticular disease and Alzheimer's disease, fatigue, migraines, PMS, cancer risk, high blood pressure, menopause, insomnia. So it's a super wide range of conditions. Muscle recovery after a workout, like got the full range, and explain like exactly how that nutrient is linked with that specific challenge. And then there's a table in the appendices that lists all of the nutrients that have been strongly linked with 120 different diseases and symptoms. So you have that bigger resource there as well. And then the book then lays out the practical application of that. So lots of practical resources for how to achieve that nutrient dense eating pattern in different ways of like specificity. So chapter 4 just lays out overall eating patterns that will help you get most of the way there without having to think about it in any more depth. So I'll just tell you what those eating patterns are. Mostly whole foods, like ideally about 80% of our calories from whole foods, which does leave 20% of calories for whatever we want. So that could even be white sugar out of the bag. Well, we don't want to get more than 10% of our calories from straight sugar, but that could be ultra processed foods is what I'm trying to say. Eating a wide diversity of foods, and then also eating or meeting serving targets of fruits and vegetables. So a vegetable and fruit forward diet are the main eating patterns that help us achieve that goal. But then you can also use the Nutrivore score, which is a measurement of nutrients per calories in foods that help can identify the most nutrient dense foods. And then I also have what I sort of build through the book is a list of nutritionally distinct foods. So foods that have something special to offer us nutritionally, or food groups that do, and how many servings of those are optimal. So we can go from just like broad eating patterns all the way to serving targets of specific food groups, depending on where you're starting from. So all of that is in the book. Daniel asked, what was the most surprising thing you learned while writing the book? That is such a fun question. What is the most surprising thing? I mean, I learned a lot reading the book. I think that is the place to start this question. And very specifically, like one of the really fun things that I got to do was to dig into a lot of the history of nutritional sciences. So there's a lot of, like that Lord Byron historical anecdote, there's a lot of those like sprinkled throughout the book. Very much, those stories are always geared at explaining the origins of some kind of pervasive diet culture, mentality, or myth, in the interest of showing like how far back these goes, right? Like, it's so far back. Like a lot of these myths come from 200 plus years ago, from before most of the nutrients were discovered. And when you can understand that like the origins of the low carb diet come from before the first vitamin was discovered, you like suddenly start to understand that those myths come from a time where like there wasn't the knowledge base to actually make those deductions. And it comes from these like charismatic characters in history. And that's how, and it's sort of getting passed down and amplified over time. And when you can sort of understand that, you sort of like forgive yourself for believing those myths. So I think those are really important stories to help us understand just how often in history dietary guidelines precede the science that needs to be there to rationalize those guidelines. And so then when you can understand that, I feel like that's really important for creating that clean slate for hearing information that maybe contradicts what we held to be true, maybe things that we took action on for years, right, or decades. So that's why I've incorporated those stories throughout. And so that was almost all like new information for me to kind of dig into those stories and try to, find like original sources and citations. Like That was a really fun part of the writing. Um, and there was lots of stories, right? I got to learn about even more stories than the ones I selected to write about too, right? So that was, I think part of it was like that, the history that I got to learn in writing this. But the single most surprising thing that I learned, something that took me hours of Googling to figure out, was that the sound, dun, 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 that sound has a name, and it is called shock horror. That is the most surprising thing. That was, I knew I needed to know the name of the sound to write it. Shock horror sound effect. That's what it's called. Um, Yep, that's the most surprising. There's lots of little surprises, lots of things that I learned for this book. Um, lots of really interesting nutrition facts and really cool studies. But I would say, yeah, the most fun to learn was the history, because that was filling in a gap in my knowledge that I didn't have. Um, and the most surprising are like the weird trivia facts that aren't actually really important to the message. Sarah says mine was delivered today. So excited to dig in. I am too. I hope you love it. I love that you can eat anything and it isn't a diet. Not only would I say, can you eat anything? I think that other than, allergies, right? Foods that you're avoiding for medical reasons, like that's a different little bucket we put over there. I think that two things, right? One is a diverse diet is one of the most important features of a healthy diet. It can actually be used as a proxy for the quality of the diet for nutrition. Because if you're eating a wide variety of foods, you're more likely to have a wide variety of nutrients, right? You're more likely to have all of your nutritional bases covered. But additionally, eating like eating the foods we want means that we're getting enough joy out of our diet that we can maintain that higher diet quality. And I think that intentionally incorporating foods that aren't particularly nutritious or nutrient dense, but that are foods that supply us with joy, is actually a really key part of the sustainable part of sustainable nutrition. So I actually think that it's not just that we can eat whatever we want, it's that we should intentionally incorporate those foods that we just love, that supply us with joy and comfort, and making, like, intentionally making room for those foods actually makes overall healthier eating patterns more sustainable. One of the things I like is your approach is a bit orthogonal to many of the other commenters who see the nutrition world in black and white terms. Yes, I think, it was, I used to think about nutrition much more black and white. I mean, I think that's kind of how I got here, was also thinking that way. And then having to, uh, like, be face to face with the science that was telling me that some of the foods that I was putting in the black category actually weren't, and probably deserved to be in the white category. And then that was the beginning of me, like, opening my eyes to um, the not just that, like, I was wrong about what bin I was putting foods in, but that even putting foods in these bins in the first place is not the right way to think about food, right? One food isn't good for you or bad for you. It's the overall composition of the diet, right? So it's the overall eating patterns. So you could eat white sugar straight out of the bag. I'm just reaching for, like, the example of a food that has the least amount of valuable nutrition. But if the rest of your diet, right, if the amount of that sugar is not surpassing the amount of, like, added sugars that are going to be problematic, which is 10% of total calories, but the rest of the composition of the diet is, mostly nutrient dense whole foods, like, that's still that overall diet. Even though you ate white sugar out of the bag, that overall diet is still high quality and it's still health promoting. And so starting to think about that, and this has been years of me deepening my understanding and really digging into the research in an even more rigorous way, and also um, working on my own food fears and expanding my diet, and, like, working on the personal part in addition to the learning part, to get to the point where I would say all foods lie on a spectrum. And I would also say we get three things from food, right? So we get energy, so that would be calories, macronutrients. We get nutrition, so I would say that's, essential nutrients, non-essential health promoting nutrients like phytonutrients and fiber, right? That's your vitamins, your minerals, your whatever. And then we get joy, we get experience, right? We get the tactile, right? The texture of the food, the flavor of the food. Maybe that food's a comfort food. It brings back memories of our childhood. We get, the dopamine response to the food, right? We get the experience of it. And foods can contribute in those three different columns differently. And some foods might not check all three boxes, right? So it might be a food like white sugar that offers energy, and maybe you love white sugar out of the bag. Maybe that you used to sneak it when you were a kid, and it reminds you of being a kid. I don't know. That's not my experience, but maybe it does give you joy, and so now you've got two of those things. You didn't get hardly any vitamins or minerals for that food, but you got something else that's still valuable. And I think the big way to set ourselves up to have higher quality diet for the long term, right, for the rest of our lives, is to value the experience that food gives us equally to the nutrients and the energy, and then understand, how we can be getting enough nutrients and not too much energy and still getting the experience and the joy, and figuring out within the foods that we like and have access to and can't afford, how can I put these pieces of my specific individual puzzle together so that I'm getting all the nutrients I need within my caloric requirements and I'm still getting joy. And when we can do that, that's when we get off the diet roller coaster. That's when we stop the yo-yo and we just adopt healthy eating patterns. So that is my goal. That is my goal of what to help people learn how to do. And that is the whole point of my book. Kari says, do you think the book will help problem solve for those of us that would love to eat a less restrictive diet, but have to because of celiac disease, and it's not just gluten, but all grains and dairy? Yeah, I do. The permissive mindset is a separate thing from dietary restriction for medical reasons. I think there's a couple of important mindset shifts that the conversation in the book will encourage, but also that I've talked about plenty of times on social media, which is one, just because a food doesn't work for me does not make it a bad food. It doesn't mean that it's a food that everyone should avoid. And I think that kind of wrapping, that can be really hard, right? It can be really hard to know that if I personally eat that food, I'm going to be very ill, but I still don't want to label that food as a bad food. I just want to say that's a food that doesn't work for me. That mindset shift is really challenging, but I think it's also really liberating once you can get there. So once I can view bread as not bad, just that I need to choose gluten-free bread, that is a very different situation. And obviously if you also have to select grain-free bread, that is a little bit more limiting, but fortunately there are more options now. And so I think that's one part of that mindset. But I think the other thing that the book encourages, that I also encourage, is to find the diversity in the other things, right? So to find the food joy and find all the different ways to mix it up and to expand the diet with all of the other foods that you don't have to restrict for medical reasons. And so I think that those couple of different mindset shifts, I think, are going to improve diet quality, and also, for example, in the book, the link with calcium is PMS. So that is the specific health challenge that is drilled down and examined in terms of calcium. And then I talk about dairy and how dairy products, as the most concentrated food source of calcium, reduce the risk of PMS. And then I talk about, can't do dairy. Here are other food sources of calcium, including a little section that is a joke on let me just find it here. It's a little play on the old Got Milk ads, and it is got molasses because molasses is one of the best food sources of calcium. So, can't do dairy. Other great sources of calcium include bone-in, canned fish, green cruciferous vegetables like kale, collard greens, and turnip greens, seaweed, and molasses. And then a little examination of the cool things that molasses has. So, so I think there's all kinds of little tidbits like that throughout the book. And anytime that I'm talking about a good source of nutrients, I mention the other sources. So it actually could be potentially an even better resource just because when we have to avoid foods for medical reasons, it's really important to understand what the nutritional impact on our entire diet of that is going to be. Sometimes it's going to be negligible. Like there's nothing that gluten containing grains have that we can't get from other foods. But if you're avoiding all grains, like what is the nutritionally similar food? It's going to be legumes. And if you can't do dairy, where are you going to be able to get those nutrients? Those foods that I just said, is calcium is the main thing that you're going to get from dairy. So other sources of calcium. So that is, I think, a thing that was very intentional with the book was to provide multiple different options so that you can understand where all of the sources of those nutrients are and where to get them.
What's the easiest way to track my nutrient intake? Should I just eat as I crave and try to eat less? That is a fantastic question. Thank you for pointing that out, Joy. I have a complicated answer for you. So okay, my answer kind of depends on where you're starting from. So if you are starting from, let's say, a typical American, you're eating a few meals out per week, you're getting a lot of sort of like convenience foods. The first place to start would be to just see where you can add some whole foods, maybe add some vegetables, and in a way that like doesn't take away from your joy of the meal, that is affordable, accessible, that's not draining your time. And you are allowed to prepare those vegetables in a way that you enjoy. So you are allowed to cook vegetables with tasty sauces or spices. You're allowed to add salad dressing to your salad, or like grated cheese or nuts or like bacon. Like add something to your meal, to those healthy vegetables, so that you like them. So that would be like the first place to sort of up nutrient intake, would be to think about how you can add in a way that you're setting yourself up for success, right? You're not making it taste gross. You're not making it too expensive. You're not making it take a ton of time or energy, or like you're not taking away from your meal. You're adding to it. So you're adding nutrients to your meal and you're not taking away joy from your meal. That is like the first place to start. Once you kind of have that, you can start working on like baby stepping up, more whole foods, more like variety of foods, diversity of foods, and making sure that you're getting like at least 3 servings of vegetables a day. Most scientific studies say 5 servings of vegetables is kind of optimal for optimal health. So kind of those overall eating patterns get you most of the way to a nutrient-dense diet. Like that is most of the work. So in terms of like tracking, if putting your food into a app works for you, great. Like that's I mean, more power to you. And you can use apps like Chronometer or MyFitnessPal to actually track your vitamin mineral intake. I will hopefully eventually have something like that, but I don't yet. So that is definitely something that you could do. But I think tracking is not something that works for everyone. It can be very triggering depending on your background. And it can be also very like just draining and time consuming and not fun. And the idea here is to increase diet quality without taking away our joy from food. Like we want to continue to enjoy the foods we're eating. We want to set ourselves up to make this sustainable, so that we're not doing it a short-term diet for whatever goals and then like give up in however long, right? We want to be able to adopt overall healthy eating patterns for the rest of our lives. So setting ourselves up for success means that we're not making it hard or miserable. And sometimes tracking is hard and miserable. So I would say in lieu of tracking, the best thing to do is to like work on those overall eating patterns. And then if you want to get really nitty gritty, my new book has something in it called the Nutrivore Weekly Serving Matrix. So Nutrivore, if you're not familiar, is just the goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat. And the Nutrivore Weekly Serving Matrix looks like this. So it's a checklist of foods that have something unique to offer us nutritionally. And each time you eat that food, you eyeball a serving and you check it off. And if you check all of the boxes, typically, depending on your energy requirements, that would be something like a third to half of your energy requirements, and typically like 3/4 of your nutrient requirements for the day is kind of roughly how that math works out. It's a little, based on averages.
Especially because people are different. Yes. So some people really benefit from some food while someone else might find it harmful. Absolutely. And I think to build on that point, Dan, it's very much about respecting bioindividuality, and it's also about respecting other dietary priorities that someone might have, right? So Nutrivore is not a diet. There's no rules, there's no yes foods and no foods, right? It's simply the goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat, and the nutritional sciences knowledge base to inform our day-to-day choices so that we can achieve that goal, right? That is what Nutrivore is. So that means that if somebody, let's say they don't eat pork for religious reasons, right? Well, let's just understand what nutrients are in pork and what other foods have those nutrients, and then eat those other foods, right? Like it can completely respect those dietary preferences due to religious beliefs or strong ideological beliefs, right? Somebody who really cares about the carbon footprint of their eating patterns. So, okay, beef has a really high carbon footprint. Where else can we get those same nutrients so that, we're still getting enough iron and vitamin B12? Shellfish has a much lower carbon footprint, right? So like it's about being able to cater to not just our budget and our time and energy and what foods we like, but also like it's something to layer on top of other dietary preferences, and it's infinitely flexible and modifiable. So somebody can use Nutrivore principles to add over top of a bulking diet for building muscle at the gym, right? Like it's something that could be added atop of that dietary principle. If someone gets told by their doctor that they need to follow certain dietary principles in order to, let's say, bring their cholesterol back down, it's something that will give them not just the things to cut out, but also the focus to make sure that they're getting the nutrients that are really important for regulating serum cholesterol. So it's as much about catering to other dietary priorities that we might have, whether that's for medical reasons or for other value systems, as it is for catering to our lives and the foods that we like. And those of you who asked questions to figure out if the book was a good resource for you, I hope my questions gave you clarity on whether it would be a good resource, or it's okay if it's not. Not every book is for every person. So if you came away from this and decided that you wouldn't get value from the book, that's cool. I care more that you know whether or not the book would be good for you than talking you into buying the book, if that makes sense. And for those of you who are going to get the book, once you get a chance to look at it, if you like it, I would be very appreciative if you would take the time to go leave it a review from wherever you bought it from. Those reviews are really important for creating that momentum. So I appreciate it, and so does everyone else who gets to know whether or not this book would be a good resource for them, thanks to what you shared about your experience with the book. It is seriously like the second best thing you can do to support me after reading the book, which thank you. So yeah, but please like dig into the book first, and only earnest and real reviews wanted. But yeah, please, if you like the book, please go leave it a review.